We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, which was never ceded, where we are now gathered, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and recognise that the land continues to be sacred to them. They are the guardians of the earth and of all things that grow and breed in the soil. They are the trustees of the waters, the seas, the streams, rivers, ponds and lakes, and the richness of all life in those waters. We thank them for passing their wisdom and heritage to people everywhere since the Dreamtime. We acknowledge the wrongs done to them by newcomers to this land, and we seek to be partners with them in righting these wrongs and in living together in peace, harmony with them and with the land, our common home. As we do this, we acknowledge and lament the loss of their hunting grounds, the destruction of ceremonial places and sacred sites, and the great loss of life from all kinds of violence and disease. We also call for the recognition of the sovereignty they have never ceded, for it is that sovereignty which captures the human aspiration for a truthful relationship with country and for a just and peaceful, sustainable future. A longish acknowledgement, because in it is the kernel of any decent position in relation to AUKUS, military alliances that we're engaged in, and all that flows from them. The sovereignty they have never ceded, the sovereignty that is being trampled upon every minute of every day by a military presence across this country, a presence larger and more destructive than at any time since 45. Boots on the ground that desecrate the land, deployments across the north and other parts of Australia, not just Marines, but bombers, fighter aircraft, patrol and reconnaissance aircraft, with plans afoot to station American sailors and subs near Perth, courtesy of AUKUS. And military exercises that desecrate the land, the seas, and the skies, and violate the sovereignty that was never ceded. The AUKUS story is one more chapter in this larger story. It's a story that tells of an ugly crime that is unfolding as we speak. A story that we need to be familiar with. A chapter in the story we must understand, reflect upon, and converse with others. And to help us along the way, 6 special guests this afternoon, each of whom will bring their particular insights, expertise, passion, and engagement with the issues at hand. Let me start with our first guest, our first speaker, Richard Tanter, a Senior Research Associate at the Nautilus Institute, Honorary Professor at the University of Melbourne, previously Professor of IR at RMIT, before that Professor of IR at Kyoto Seika University, former President of ICANN. Richard has worked on peace, security and environment issues in East and Southeast Asia as analyst, policy advocate, writer and activist for more than 50 years. It's a pleasure and a privilege to invite him to address us.
Thanks. And I'd better start by saying that I probably here under false pretenses, this is not a Nautilus Institute research talk. I'm just work with those folks, and I commend them. And I thank Joe for his acknowledgement of country, which I won't repeat except in one regard. Just to say that I think that what we want, what we need now, is a defensible Australia. An Australia which is defensible strategically and morally. And of course, that is not true at present about anything about our defence policy, and AUKUS deepens the problem there. And so we need honest, responsible, full history from deep time all the way through and ongoing. Okay, let's make a point to talk now. Firstly, AUKUS. In a way, I don't want to talk about AUKUS because I think it's so ridiculous, but we all know that. What's really important about it is that AUKUS is about US restructuring of its global alliances, the regional expression of it, the Australian end of it, if you like. And it's there partly because of the United States dealing with relative decline, but also its military planning for war with China, very clearly. The UK part is utter nonsense. The UK is basically nonsense these days. The rhetoric of the Anglosphere, of all the times in world history to start talking about English and what binds us together, is absurd. Of course, we're going to be paying the Americans and the British submarine manufacturers a subsidy, particularly the Brits post-AUKUS, post-Brexit nonsense. Nonsense part. The important thing is it's a new alliance system and we have a deepening part in it. More deeply integrated than the Pine Gaps and the Northwest Capes and the Vietnams and the Koreas led us into than in the past. We're paying real money now for our activities of AUKUS and what Vince Scarpatura and I have been calling AUKUS Plus. And there's this notion that we are a partner, a pseudo-partner, which is a delusion on the Australian side, and the Americans know exactly what we're getting there. Pillar 1, submarines. We know about that. Again, China is what it's about. The only rational strategic use for fast, long endurance, long range, extremely well armed, even in conventional terms, submarines for Australia is to be auxiliaries, that old Roman term, of assistance to the primary imperial power in China. There's no other rational use for it, which makes the whole thing deeply irrational in multiple ways. You all know the 3 stages, the bizarrely called optimal Australian sovereign pathway for submarines. Firstly, rotational deployment of American Virginia class, very big submarines, 9,000, next generation will be 10,000, to HMAS Sterling at Fremantle there. In a year or so, so that'll happen next year. At the same time, a thing called Submarine Rotational Fleet West, an organisational concept, we don't really know exactly what it's about, will centre on Fremantle, and at the same time at Defence Precinct Henderson across the way, also in Fremantle, where BAE, the 6th largest armaments company in the world, but the last British one standing, which suggests that maybe not much longer, will be given an enormous amount of money to build submarines, principally in Britain, but also here. We also know that each of those 3 stages becomes progressively less likely. We will get those rotational deployments in next year. In a few years, we will get some kind of American second-hand Virginia-class submarines. And in the never land of the future, the British designed, well, they're not even designed, but the British named AUKUS-class submarines, and that's when the hundreds of billions of dollars start to become involved. And at each stage, there are so many contingencies, which we're beginning to be aware of, that we have less certainty, more money, and more certainty that our control and command of those submarines, if they ever eventuate, will be principally American, either in name or in reality. So progressively less likely. Secondly, AUKUS Pillar 2, we talk about, Vince Scarpatura and I have been talking about AUKUS Plus because there's a whole lot more happening. We've talked about that, Joe just mentioned, the nuclear-capable bomber rotational deployments of B-52s at Tyndall starting sometime in the next year or so, probably others at other bases like B2s going to Anderley. This is serious change in Australia's nuclear posture. In the past, through Pine Gap and Northwest Cape, we've supported American nuclear planning. This time, we are providing the bases for nuclear-capable bombers. We are providing the strike aircraft to protect them. We are providing the tankers, which will get them there. We are providing the airborne early warning and command aircraft, which will, in this kind of mad idea, enable them to penetrate Chinese defences. The Chinese are going to have an opinion about that, I'm very sure. The second development in the Pillar 2 is something which in fact has nothing to do with AUKUS but was cooked up 10 years ago, is a very new development at Northwest Cape, just south of the very big communication station, just at the township of Exmouth. And it consists of this extraordinary array of 27 very large antennas, radar antennas, aimed at satellites 36,000 kilometres above the Earth. It's the most important new American surveillance development in the world. It'll have a partner in Britain. But basically, we are real estate again in providing the enabling for American space warfare. I'll finish with two things Joseph said. Firstly, AUKUS is about the foreign penetration of Australia and the erosion, the even deeper erosion of Australian capacity for defence decision-making and, essentially, Australian democracy. And lastly, it is very clear, and I was really pleased to see the pamphlet that's just gone out here, Gaza is part of this. Gaza, Australia, United States, the violent fragmentation of American imperialism. We know about weapons exports thanks to Michelle Fay and Kelly Tranter's extraordinary work. You know about Pine Gap's role in this. And this is central. AUKUS, Gaza, American imperialism. It's all part of one. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard. I know there was so much more to say. You would have said and didn't have time to say, but we'll be able to develop some of these points further down the track. Our next speaker is Margie Beavis, another stalwart of the peace movement, a former GP who teaches at the University of Melbourne, Vice President of the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, Co-Chair of ICANN Australia, Co-Convener of Quit Nukes, a campaign to stop superannuation funds supporting nuclear weapons companies. Margie, I invite you to...
Thank you very much. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners and the ongoing impacts of colonialism on their health and incarceration rates and so much more. AUKUS is stupid on so many levels, it's really difficult to know where to start. I am turning pages, obviously, because I've got slides to go with it, so thank you for turning the pages. We need a national security strategy that overrides the defence strategy. What would really make people more secure? We need to address poverty, domestic violence, homelessness, legal aid, closing the gap. There are so many areas where we could spend so much more money. With poverty, Australia has one of the lowest unemployment payments. It's dropped from about half of the OECD poverty rate to about a third in the last 2 decades. Those on job seeker, youth allowance and other allowances have to choose between having a solid meal each day, paying the rent, getting medications. We should have these payments at least at the level of the pension. The human costs are high. People often don't get a meal, a solid meal in their day, 14 times more likely not to get a decent meal. They're significantly more likely to die by suicide, and intergenerational poverty is well established. Domestic violence. You hear about the deaths from domestic violence over and over and over again. What does someone need when they're in a terrible relationship? They need a house to go to, and they need legal support to get intervention orders and other such. So in terms of homelessness, it's drastically underfunded. Over 100 people every night are homeless. You don't see them, only about 1 in 20 is actually visible. The rest are on couches and in cars and other places. The services for homelessness are completely overwhelmed. Over 300 people a day are turned away. This is a disgrace in such a wealthy country. Legal aid. Legal aid is close to mythical. Most of the people on these allowances are considered too wealthy to qualify for legal aid. And so often, terrible legal situations arise, complicating dire situations and other challenges. They need legal aid. The Law Council came out probably almost a decade ago saying that hundreds of millions of dollars in cuts have pushed legal aid to the brink of collapse, and things certainly have not improved. Okay, so here's a nice little graphic. What would one submarine buy? And the 48 billion includes what we call sustainment, so just buying the submarine and keeping it going. Well, I'm not sure that tax cuts would be my top priority, but it's interesting to note that the fourth priority is what it would cost to make job seeker of the level of pension, which would remove a lot of poverty in Australia. I'm sure you'd all have your own personal lists of what you think you could spend to make people actually more secure in Australia. What else has gone out the window with AUKUS? Strategic thought around climate change and action seems to have gone out the window. The target of 62 to 70% condemns us to 3 degrees. We need leadership, ideally, at least 75%, but 100% by 2035 would be much more likely to help. What else would make people more secure? Well, it would be good to have a military system that actually focused on defending Australia. And that should actually be designed once we've reviewed all of our national priorities. Security does not equal defence. There's a reading list there of some terrific people who've put forward some good ideas, which includes the US Library of Conquest. I'll get to them later. The other cost is societal attitudes. We're being pushed in one direction. There's a militarisation of our society happening. Jobs, jobs, jobs. These are jobs that are substitutions. They're not additions. At ridiculous cost. If you do very crude mathematics of the jobs that are promised here in Australia, it works out at about $18 million a job. I want one. It provides narrow skill sets. It diverts people from training in so many other important areas: work on climate, scientific innovation, education, healthcare. And universities and schools' educational priorities are being distorted by this program. They're given a lot of money. Another distortion is the cost to government priorities. I really do wonder if our government has been captured by its intelligence and security advisors. There is certainly a huge cohort, a phalanx of ex-government people in very well-paid positions who have a vested interest in this continuing. And there's also the media, who also seem to go along for the ride. A third slide on societal attitudes is the psychological cost. And I quote Richard Miles at a Submarine Institute of Australia, saying, people's heads are in the right place. People do have a sense of anxiety that the world is a pretty complex and volatile place. This does give a basis on which you can then provide a narrative about why we would be spending a very considerable amount of money on this particular platform. I think it was Goebbels who said that if you made people afraid enough, they would do anything. Reputational cost. I'm sorry, this program is so stupid that we must look like idiots globally. We're facing self-delusion and it's being crossed with gaslighting. This program is terrific for the US and the UK. They get lots of money, they get bases, they get influence. For Australia, it's an extremely high-risk gamble. In fact, the US have told us a number of times that we are not going to get any of their Virginia-class submarines. How many times do we need to be told? Here is just a sample of the times we need to be told. The Navy's nominee for Chief Operations has said there's no magic beans to increase shipbuilding. Another has said it's crazy for the United States to give away its single most important asset, and that's the person who's reviewing AUKUS in the US. And the US Congressional Research Service proposed a whole alternative plan for us. What happens if we don't get the submarines? That same service noted that we haven't actually even considered alternatives, that no rigorous comparative analysis was done. There is no plan B. The UK subs are also looking pretty dodgy. The watchdog has said that for the last 3 years, every year, that the reactor program for these submarines is unachievable, and they'll probably be obsolete by the time they arrive. Finally, the cost is the loss of sovereignty, which others will talk about, but also the loss of diplomacy. This is a dumb decision, and Australia, with China as the major trading partner and US as a strong ally, should be working really hard to stop an appalling war that is unwinnable. We urgently need a review of AUKUS Pillars 1 and 2, and of course scrapping once they've worked out what they actually mean, a national security strategy that is not purely based on defence, and we need more diplomacy and peace building.
Thank you very much, Margie. How to fit so much in so little time. Marvellous. Okay, now we turn to Emma Shortis, who is the director of the Australian Institute's International Security Affairs Program. Previously lectured at RMIT, she's a historian and writer focusing on history and politics of the United States and its role in the world, and recently authored After America, Australia and the New World Order. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you for having me. I will start, I think, by just reiterating what the other speakers have said and reminding everybody that AUKUS is at its heart a political stunt. It was a political stunt cooked up by a few blokes in the Morrison government. It was never put before cabinet. What will become, if it is successful, the greatest ever transfer of Australian sovereign wealth internationally was never put to Treasury, as far as we know. And it, of course, has never been before Parliament. So this is how critical decisions about the future of Australian security are made in this country with no democratic accountability whatsoever. And I think we could be generous and say that the then Labor opposition agreed to AUKUS under significant political pressure for perhaps understandable pragmatic reasons in the lead up to an election. But circumstances have changed somewhat since then. I think we can probably all agree. And public opinion is shifting, I think, in response to that. I think it's worth reminding ourselves continuously that the Australian community is largely against AUKUS. They're against this deal. So we've done polling at the Australia Institute. It was actually back in April, May, in the lead up to the election. We asked Australians if they would prefer a closer alliance with the United States or a more independent foreign policy. And 54% of respondents chose a more independent foreign policy. And if you know anything, I think, about the history of public opinion about the alliance, Australia's alliance with the United States, that's potentially a seismic shift in how Australians view our relationship with the United States. And as I said, that was done in April, May. Trump has done a lot of trumping since then. So I suspect when we do it again, those numbers will have shifted even further. And I think it's worth also emphasising that in that same poll, we asked about support for a parliamentary inquiry into the AUKUS deal, and the vast majority of Australians support a parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS. So to give another shameless plug, if you head over to the Australia Institute's website, we have a petition running that already has tens of thousands of signatures calling for an independent parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS. So you can go to our website and add your name if you haven't already. So that's a way of arguing that there is actually significant political space, I think, for movement on AUKUS. There is room and I think support for the Labor government to say the UK has done a review into the AUKUS deal. The United States is currently doing a review into the AUKUS deal. It's time Australia, which has the most to lose in this deal, the most at risk and is investing the most, to also have an independent review. And that's for a number of reasons, of course. We've spoken about already the significant risks of failure in this deal. The way it was put to me by one defence official was that every link in the AUKUS chain is weak. The question is just which one breaks first. But there are also significant risks of success and even partial success to the AUKUS deal. And I wanted to focus on those just for a moment. So you will all be, of course, aware that it is historically very unusual for Australian governments to ever say no to participation in US-led wars. In fact, we often offer up our support before we're even asked for it. What AUKUS does is make that the default position. It makes Australian participation in US-led wars the default position. And that's for very practical reasons. Richard mentioned, the part of the AUKUS deal that allows for rotation of US nuclear submarines. Part of that deal also involves Australian crew being on US-flagged Virginia-class submarines. And what that means is that an administration, be it the Trump administration or whatever comes next, decides to go to war for whatever reason and wherever it is, not only would an Australian government have to say no to participation in that war, they would have to actively delay the deployment of US Virginia-class submarines in order to find and extract Australian crew. I don't know about you, but I find it hard to imagine an Australian government in the immediate future at least being brave enough to do that. And I find it hard to imagine any US administration, a friendly one or a not so friendly one, copying that from an Australian government, from an ally. I can point you to a story just this morning where Republican Senator Ted Cruz and a bunch of his colleagues have written to the Australian government warning that there may be punitive measures for Australia's symbolic recognition of the state of Palestine, which goes against US policy. So we can imagine, I think, how a US administration would treat Australia, any Australian government in those circumstances. And I think it's worth emphasising that particularly with the Trump administration, it doesn't matter what we give them. It doesn't matter how much we beg. It doesn't matter how many billions of dollars we pour into this AUKUS deal. It will never be enough. That's not how Trump operates. And it seems our polling suggests, the evidence suggests that the Australian public understands that much better than the current government understands it. And I wanted to finish, I suppose, because, it's so hard, I think, to find hope in the current times, by arguing that political space that I talked about, the support from the Australian community for parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS, shifting opinions about the alliance, offer us a huge opportunity. Donald Trump offers us an opportunity, just as Margie said, to rethink our security, to recognise that our alliance with the United States in its current form does not make us safer, and to have a genuine democratic conversation about what does make us safer. Trump allows us to do that, and as those of you who've followed US politics and the alliance for a long time would know all too well, they are rare and precious moments in Australian history, and we have the opportunity to seize it. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Emma, not least for the hopeful note on which you ended. We'll come back to all of that, I hope. Our next speaker is Hamish McPherson. Hamish is a school teacher in regional Victoria. He's a member of the Australian Labor Party and Victorian convener of Labour Against War, and obviously much to do on that front. Hamish.
Friends, I'm very pleased to speak to you today on behalf of Labour Against War, which is a national organisation of rank and file members of the Labor Party, hundreds strong, who are very much opposed to the AUKUS Pact and the prospect of war with China. We were founded 2 years ago, and since then we've waged a public and very resolute campaign against AUKUS. I'm obviously not here to speak today on behalf of the Labor government. We openly disagree with the federal leadership about AUKUS, and that it has anything to do with the interests of the Australian people. We are very conscious that AUKUS was the product of the Morrison government and a group of Australian military advisors who were concerned that by buying French submarines that would take us out of the US orbit. Australia lobbied for AUKUS and it was signed by Biden and Boris Johnson. And yeah, complete lack of scrutiny or democratic accountability in its adoption. Unfortunately, since coming to power in 2022, the Albanese government has not sought to review the pact or move away from it. If anything, it has embraced the pact wholeheartedly. But clearly, what was already a really problematic deal under the Biden administration is just complete madness with a Trump administration, who we know is an authoritarian leader and who is on a daily basis abusing basic democratic values. So we're now in a situation, a humiliating situation, where we have our Defence Minister Richard Marles routinely visiting Washington and cozying up to henchmen of the Trump administration like Pete Hegseth and literally handing over billions of taxpayer dollars to fund the US industrial military shipbuilding work. Even more recently, in London, we've had the colonial cretinism of Keir Starmer and King Charles being recruited to advocate for AUKUS with the would-be King Trump. Now, in terms of our campaign in the Labor Party and the Labor movement, there are very many reasons to oppose AUKUS, but we have been clear that the main reason to oppose AUKUS is not a pact that is to do with building a more secure future for the Australian people. It is not a pact about defending the Australian mainland. It is a pact for war. It is about locking Australia into the US agenda in East Asia, to aggressively contain China and to plan for a possible war with China. And we've heard today from other speakers already about the real impacts of that in terms of Australia becoming a base for active US military forces. Our real concern is that the submarine rotation through Western Australia, the B-52 bombers in Northern Australia, are nuclear weapons capable. And as Richard explained to us, that is a very worrying shift in our embrace of the nuclear stance. So, in our campaign against AUKUS, we have found a strong and growing opposition to the AUKUS Pact within the Australian Labor Party from rank and file members, supporters and the union movement. We first raised opposition back at the 2023 National Conference, where the federal leadership rolled out the big guns and ministers to push through inclusion of AUKUS in the national platform. Thankfully, there were voices at the conference who opposed the AUKUS Pact. MP Josh Wilson from Fremantle, the National Secretary of the Electrical Trades Union, Michael Wright, and Felicity Wade from the Labor Environment Action Network spoke on the platform to oppose it. Pat Conroy, Assistant Defence Minister, made a complete turkey of himself when he got up and said that the opponents of AUKUS were appeasing China and compared us to Prime Minister Menzies during the pig iron dispute in the 1930s around exports to Japan. This outraged delegates, including the members of the Electrical Trades Union. When it was put to the vote, maybe a quarter to a third of the delegates voted against AUKUS, which was, a start. Since National Conference, our assessment is that the federal leadership is losing the political argument about AUKUS in the Australian community, as Emma has pointed to, but also within the Labor movement. We have a national motion calling for a full review of AUKUS, calling for branches or party units to submit submissions to any such review supporting withdrawal, and calling for it to be removed from the national platform. In the past 2 years, we've passed that motion in 60 branches nationally. That includes 24 this year and 18 branches in Victoria. Now, the thing to remember with those 60 branches is those motions have often been passed in the face of very serious pressure not to rock the boat. This is an initiative that rank and file members are taking to raise the question in their communities and with their colleagues and comrades. At the recent Victorian Labor State Conference, which occurred on the 2nd of 3rd of August, we had considerable success in passing clear policy and resolutions against AUKUS. The State Labor Conference is 600 delegates, 300 union delegates, 300 elected from branches. With the support of the left, the independent delegates and key trade unions, we passed resolutions and policy with the similar key points that I referred to earlier. Thank you. Let's make two final points. We are aware that the Labor Party has a very contradictory record when it comes to wars and foreign policy. We know that it is the party of Richard Marles and Pat Conroy, a party of national defence and loyalty to the US alliance. It is the party of Bob Hawke, which took us into the 1991 Gulf War.
Shame.
But it is also the party that stood clearly against the Vietnam War. Here in Victoria, it's the party of members such as Arthur Corwell, Jim Cairns and Joan Coxidge, who took a principled position against the war and worked with the left to build a powerful anti-war movement. It is the party of Simon Crean, who in 2003 took a principled position and spoke at the mass rally in Sydney in opposed to the Iraq invasion. Importantly, it is the party and the Labor movement of members of working people, which has a proud tradition of opposing militarism. It's a struggle within the party and the movement, but the one we're willing to take up. Because we know that it might be the generals and the politicians who declare war, but it's working people who pay the cost. Yeah. In injuries, in psychological damage, in grief and in sorrow. And that is why we will continue to oppose AUKUS and any move towards war with China. It would be a disaster. It would be a disaster for the people of Australia, for the people of Asia and the Pacific. And we stand wholeheartedly with the movement, with everybody here today, in saying we will maintain our resolute and public opposition to AUKUS. It will be a tough fight, but the process of contesting AUKUS means we are also doing a very important thing. We are rebuilding an anti-war movement in this country, a tradition of anti-militarism, and that in itself is worth fighting for. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hamish, for a spirited address of where we're at and where we're aiming to go. Thank you. Our next speaker is Stephanie Tusen. Stephanie has spent 6 years at the Health and Community Services Union, 3 as an organiser and now as projects and political liaison officer, driving public health equity initiatives and co-founding AUKUS for Peace, a powerful rank-and-file movement for Palestine. Steph, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, comrades. I want to start by acknowledging the very real crisis that healthcare workers and hospitals, disability services, drug and alcohol services and mental health services, indeed aged care as well, find themselves across the country right now. I think it's fair to say that all of those services are in peacetime emergencies. And we need to be very clear that they are absolutely under threat. All the while, health and community services workers across the country are routinely underfunded, unsupported, and now find themselves in the position where they are being signed up for a war. Let's be honest, that's what AUKUS is in the long run, that they don't want to be a part of, and yet they will be in charge of picking up the pieces of. So for the next couple of minutes, I just want to invite you to put aside whether or not the Commonwealth is responsible for a thing or the state is responsible for a thing, because I don't know about you, but I'm a working class person. I'm a stepmom, I'm a daughter, I'm an auntie, I'm a friend, and I'm sort of at the point where I don't give a shit who's responsible for funding what. I just want things to work when the people I love need it most. right? So I don't want to bore you with stats, but I think these ones really strike me as important and ones we really need to think about in the context of AUKUS. So right now in this country, the suicide rate is 2.5 times higher than the road toll. In Victoria alone, it is nearly triple. Every year in this country, nearly 500,000 Australians seek assistance with drugs, alcohol and gambling, and they can't get it. Half of them are turned away. Tell me what health condition we turn away half the people who seek help, right? In Victoria right now, 7,500 NDIS participants who live in group homes are facing the prospect of being evicted from their homes come the 31st of December. That's where we're at. And I don't know about you, but as a working class person and someone who has the great privilege of looking after, defending and working with the incredible healthcare workers in this state and indeed across the country, to me that's not good enough. And to me, surely we have a moral imperative to fix that first. Surely that comes first, in the same way housing does, in the same way job seeker does, in the same way the climate crisis does. These things need to come first. Something personal about me, I was thinking about it on the way here today. Hands up in the room, parents, mums, dads, grandparents, custodians of little people. Yeah, right, cool. So very recently I've become a stepmother in the last 2 years, thank you, which has been the most magical, most wondrous, most joyous secret that I didn't know I had to know, right? So you're all way ahead of me. But I think inevitably what happens then is you think about those statistics in the context of the little people. And I think about the world I want my little people to grow up in. And the sad thing and the most terrifying thing for me is that I know that if they need mental health services tomorrow, I can't guarantee that they're going to get them. If they need to go to rehab in a couple of years or whatever, I can't guarantee they'll be able to go. 1 in 3 Australians have a mental health condition, 1 in 4 suffer with addiction, 1 in 6 have a disability. I want to live in a world where if my little people need help, they get the help. I want to live in a world where we're not signing up the little people to wars that we as parents and grandparents and custodians of little people don't want to fight. And I sure as hell don't want them growing up with that anxiety about the impending war that might be coming tomorrow. Working class people and the trade unionists in the room, I think we have an obligation to be talking to as many working class people and their families as we can. Because as much as I've talked about the experience of us touching healthcare workers, the reality is a disastrous, stupid, embarrassing decision like AUKUS doesn't just affect the healthcare workers, it affects the manufacturers, the construction workers, and I'd argue the most vulnerable participants, consumers and patients in the country who simply are not being looked after right now. They are not. And if we can't look after them now, what hope have we got after spending over $300 billion on a bunch of submarines that we don't want? I don't know about any of you, but I don't remember being asked. I'll leave my comments there. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Steph, for bringing to our attention some very unpleasant, but part of the unpleasant news about the state of affairs, but part of the reality we need to address. And our last speaker is Tim Reid. He's the Green State MP from Brunswick. He was previously a doctor treating and researching sexually transmitted infections like HIV and before that a GP. We greatly look forward to hearing from you.
So I'd just like to thank the organisers for inviting me and just say that our federal spokesperson for foreign policy and peace and disarmament, Senator David Shoebridge, would have liked to have attended but couldn't. So you've got a state MP, which is a bit like getting a generic drug instead of a brand name drug. It should do the job. I'd like to also reiterate the acknowledgement of the Wurundjeri, the traditional owners, and offer my respects to their elders. We've heard a long list of reasons why AUKUS is a bad idea, our loss of our independence. We could add more to the list, nuclear waste. I'm particularly worried also about how it could provoke a bit of a regional arms race. I'm not even talking about China here. I'm talking about countries between Indonesia and India who will somehow feel a bit provoked and a bit uncomfortable having such a heavily armed neighbour and feel obliged to somehow follow and be impoverished in the process. I mean, one of the worst things about AUKUS is that it will impoverish us to an extent. But think about countries that don't have the health and education and social welfare that we do. But I'm going to keep away from most of those other reasons and just focus on one, because I want to turn our attention to how to stop AUKUS. So Trump's project, his global project to get Western democracies to spend twice as much as they already do on defence, on war, let's be honest, is going to suck funding in all of those countries, including Australia, from the very services that Steph just described. Right? It'll suck funding out of schools and hospitals and aged care. It'll suck funding out of the clean energy transition. A couple of days ago, we just heard that an auction, a reverse auction for offshore wind, which is important in getting us off coal, that reverse auction's been delayed. And one of the reasons it's been delayed is uncertainty about federal funding. Well, we can see where the federal funding's going. I don't know how many wind turbines you get for one periscope, but it'd be a lot, right? In fact, a core part of AUKUS that we haven't discussed a great deal is how Australia becomes further enmeshed in the US military-industrial complex, and how we see, as part of AUKUS, a growth of defence industry in particularly regional cities in Australia, in Bendigo, Geelong, Benalla. We're seeing more weapons manufacturing planned or underway. And talk about this, we've raised this even in state parliament, and the answer we get back is jobs, 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 jobs. A researcher called Garrett Peltier from the US a few years ago looked at the annual US defence budget, which was $260 billion US, and asked how many people would that employ. By the way, $260 billion US is just a bit more than the $370 or so billion Australian that is planned for AUKUS, allegedly. I mean, does any project run on budget? But just stick with me. $260 billion US would employ about 2.5 million people in building, for a year, in building wind farms and solar farms. It would employ about 3.5 million people in healthcare. That's all healthcare, but in kind of lower income healthcare, lower wage healthcare, things like, say, mental health or drug and alcohol or aged care, it would employ more than that. It would employ 5 million school teachers. So, why have we still got AUKUS and how do we stop it? Well, there was a great opportunity to stop it when Labor won the election in 2022, and an even better one when they won the recent election with a thumping majority, and Trump, the crazy despot, as president. Perfect time to announce a review of AUKUS and say, oh, well, look, we thought it was a good idea at the time, but on reflection. But who's organised the review? The US, to see if they can get a better deal out of us, probably. So the Greens in federal parliament have been opposing AUKUS, but there's a phenomenon of federal electoral arithmetic, which is the Greens have power when Labor and the Conservatives disagree. But unfortunately, with Scott Morrison's AUKUS project, Labor and the Liberals are on a unity ticket, and the Greens find themselves isolated with some crossbenchers. So the real power to stop this must happen outside of Parliament. And I acknowledge also Hamish's work within Labor. That's clearly important, no question. But there was a US politician, and I should have looked this up, who once was persuaded to do something by some advocates and said, right, you convinced me to do it, now go out there and make me do it.
Roosevelt.
Thank you, Roosevelt. One of the Roosevelts. The key point is that without community advocacy, now not just advocacy, without community uproar, nothing's going to happen. Because when Labor, Liberal and Nationals are all on the same page, we need uproar. So we need to demand decent funding for healthcare and education. And we can't blame AUKUS. We need to do more than that. We need to say submarines are the reason. We need to talk about tangible things that people can picture. I don't know what an AUKUS looks like. Could someone draw me an AUKUS? But I can picture a submarine. And I had a little go in commenting in the media the other day about the delayed wind farm auction. I said if these were submarines, they'd be built in an instant. But we need to be, that comment needs to be in articles about funding healthcare. It needs to be in the debate about where's the $2.5 billion that the Victorian government's stripped from Gonski funding gone. That's a small part of a submarine, I guess. We need to be saying submarines and blaming submarines every time we're opposing cuts in funding, every time we're opposing privatisation. We need to get involved in those campaigns and helping people join the dots, make the link between the apparent shortage of funding, because it is only apparent, and this ridiculous ongoing financial commitment. Because I think that is the way to generate the community uproar that we need. Thank you.
All right, let me start with a question that I find intriguing but also important. We've heard from all of you a wonderful catalogue of all the things that are wrong with this idea and related ideas with this project. How can an intelligent country like Australia, if it is, get into this mess? How did it happen? How did we allow ourselves into this mess? I ask it because if, in my view, we don't know something, we can't come up with something like an answer to that question, we won't know how to get out of it. How did we get into this mess? And you can interrupt each other, by the way. Freewheeling conversation.
In one word, wedge politics pre-election. That basically this was Morrison's big chance to try and make the Labor Party look weak on defence. The Labor Party, instead of rejecting it, swallowed it hook, line and sinker, and here we are.
I think I disagree. I agree totally about the wedging and Labor, obviously. And Morrison, his art has to be acknowledged in constructing this miasma so effectively. But I think it was planned. I think this is an American plan. I don't mean anything conspiratorial, just in rational strategic planning, rational alliance management and restructuring, and then foreign penetration. What we call foreign influence, is actually foreign penetration. And I think there have been very effective interventions. Some part of it is told in the new book on the Morrison decision. But people like Andrew Shearer, who shuttled backwards and forwards from Australian intelligence agencies to American think tanks back into intelligence agencies. And there are a number of people like that. Not illegal, it's just normal. And then you have people like Richard Miles, who has never heard a word out of Washington that he wants to disagree with, and enthusiastically endorsed it, and all the usual Labor Party reasons. But I would argue This has been a plan which has been developing for some time. The fact that it's got massive internal contradictions, high likelihood of coming off the rails at different points. What's unusual about that? I'm sorry, I just think it's easy to blame Morrison. It's certainly easy to blame those Labor Party politicians the night before they had to make the decision, and everything that Emma and Tim have said. Yeah. But remember, this is part of empire.
Sorry, go.
Yeah, I would agree that it runs quite deep in that the Australian government and the military and has a very long pattern of wanting to be a power in Asia, but doing so very much as a sub-imperial power of the United States. So I think that whilst there is a lot of influence from the US in favour of the AUKUS agreement, I think it is also the product of the Australian government, the Australian military establishment. I think blame lies within our own governing system as well, and we need to not just see this as a US-led. I mean, it is about supporting the US, but it is also about Australia, a section of the Australian ruling elite thinking that this is a means to have a more powerful military Australia. So I think the blame lies in our own domestic government as well.
Just to follow this up a little bit, just for a minute or two, it is, we've heard, politicians, it is the empire, the imperial power, and it is those who benefit from the imperial connection. Are we able to name those powerful interests in Australia that have a stake in maintaining the imperial connection? Can we name them? I don't mean names of people, names of groups, institutions, structures. Can we name them? Or is it just individuals? You all have a chance.
I mean, I think it's partly structural. You know, Richard's talked about the integration of Australian defence agencies, particularly Australian intelligence agencies, with the United States. So it's not necessarily even that they have a direct interest in it, it's that the assumptions about the need to be not just interchangeable, but as our friend Richard Miles would say, seamlessly interoperable with the United States. The assumption that that's a good and necessary thing is so baked in that it's not even necessarily possible for people within those structures to examine those assumptions, because that doesn't become just a question of evidence and logic or thinking about Australian defence or Australian security. That's an existential question, and that means questioning the assumptions that you have built all of your policy on for 75 years. So I think we can't underestimate the difficulty of overcoming that culture within the broad structures of Australian foreign policy, who wouldn't see it as self-interested, they'd see it as entirely logical. And I think there's a real disjuncture there that we sometimes fail to understand between what the community thinks and sees and what happens in those spaces. There is absolutely commercial interest as well, like we heard one of the names, but there's an exchange between government and defence and think tanks, much in the way there's an exchange between, you know, ministers for resources who go on to work for fossil fuel companies. It's the same kind of system. So there's absolutely interest there, but I think it's also deeply structural and is really a foundational question of national identity more than anything.
Yeah, I'd say the deputy sheriff trope, I think about it like an archetype in a play. Like Australia is trying to break this archetypal character we've been playing for decades and decades and decades. And every now and then it's like our cool, bigger brothers let us cosplay and be cool like them. I'm thinking specifically like Remember the press conference when they all had their aviators on the pontoon, and it was like, oh no, here we go, this is gonna suck, and it did suck. It really sucked. But yeah, it's trying to break that deputy sheriff vibe all the time. But also, I know someone mentioned Joe Hockey. I mean, it does sort of get to a point too where it's spot the ex-Liberal or Labor Prime Minister working in defence.
And that's very clear in lobbying firms that specialise in defence. So Pine and Partners being just one of them. There are two or three.
Never employ him.
And so they seem to be quite lucrative.
Yeah.
Just briefly.
Yes, please.
So in terms of the deputy sheriff role that Australia is well practiced in playing and took us into the Iraq War and Afghanistan and all these disastrous conflicts, there was an interesting case of that recently where Richard Marles was actually in Papua New Guinea opening a new joint naval facility with Papua New Guinea on Manus Island. Of course, we've had a neo-colonial sort of interest in Manus Island as the place we ship off refugees and asylum seekers to. But this joint naval facility, a little like we're playing the role with PNG like US plays with us. Marles has assured that Papua New Guinea will have sovereignty over this space, but Australia will also be able to base its navy in Manus Island, and it's north-facing towards North Asia, so presumably this is also in the interest of projecting military power into North Asia. Albanese has also been trying to sign military pacts with Papua New Guinea, whereby PNG citizens will be able to be recruited into the Australian military. Again, I think this is an example of how our deputy sheriff role is both, subservient to the US, but is also not, in that we are acting as an independent imperial power in our own region also.
Can I just say one thing? Just on that PNG, the other side of it is there will be Australians appointed to the PNG Defence Force. It's called Neo-Colonialism Part 3, isn't it? I think in answer to Joe's question, everything that we talked about, that Margie and Tim have talked about, and that Emma and Stephanie pointed out, that these background variables are important. But I also think you asked how did this happen? One thing is the pattern within the Defence Department and the Defence Force. There are careers being made now. Not just now, but it's happened for a long time. You see it in intelligence, but you see it in the people who work at Pine Gap. If you want a career, there's a path, because you'll spend 6 months learning how to do it, or even 3 years at Buckley Space Force, knowing how Space Force base, learning how to do it. Or you'll be in Indo-Pacific Command. But careers, that's one way it is. And I'm not saying that's the answer, but rather I think it's all of what we're talking about, and that's what I actually really like the way Stephanie, framed it. That's the range, and Tim's saying, that's the range of engagement we've got with all across here. And one of the things that somebody who's been writing in recent years about Pine Gap, but also about the history of B-52s, one of the things that's striking is very clearly the loss of that institutional capability to actually make the decision. Is what Minister is proposing in Australian interests, or in American interests, or both, or neither, and that's gone. There's been a purging.
Okay, well, we've talked about some of the powerful pressures which are pointing in the direction of continuing the military alliance in its various forms, of which AUKUS is part. And we could have added a few more, because a few more institutions, several media chains would have a commitment, and they would be brought out, if need be, to crucify any government that took a different position. Educational institutions are being penetrated in significant ways, including schools. Okay. All these factors, and probably a lot more, have got us into this mess. What will it take for us to be able to undo it in the reasonably foreseeable future, not 20 years from now? What would it take? What will it take?
An opportunity.
Yes, go on.
Why don't I just make 2 quick points? One small thing, not sufficient on its own, but I think our integrity institutions are very important. I'm talking about anti-corruption commissions and the like, and particularly with the closeness. When you get industry and government enmeshed and very close, that's when there is a risk of corruption and decisions being made for personal gain. And so I think that close attention to those institutions and strengthening them is important, but not sufficient. The pathway I see, obviously, is for everybody to do everything all at once, but the one thing in particular that I alluded to is to blame submarines at every opportunity when people are missing out on the things they need. The reason we can't have nice things is submarines. The reason that there is, when I last checked a few months ago, not a single detox bed available in Victoria for months is submarines. So I think if we just we need to get people used to making that connection.
It is a huge question, but an important one, and why we're here today. So I suppose a couple of thoughts. I think the real world will intervene, and there will be a series of crises associated with AUKUS, but also with foreign policy generally. So, for example, the increasingly erratic and unstable behaviour of the United States will create a series of political crises. The prospect of increased military tension and possibly conflict in Asia will throw up real-world problems. And also, I think AUKUS itself, we've heard today about how problematic it is, how many weak links in the chain there are. But also, I think, so there'll be problems associated with actually trying to implement it. Now, the thing is, these things will all happen, but whether or not we can translate those political problems into serious political pressure on the government to withdraw depends on how well organised we are to put out propaganda and agitation and organisation to translate those crises into direct political pressure on our political leaders. So, for example, just to finish, on the sort of problematic features that people are going to start experiencing at AUKUS, I mean, a couple of examples would be there's currently discussion about where an East Coast nuclear submarine base should be. Should it be in Port Kembla? Should it be in Newcastle? Well, the Port Kembla community and the South Coast Trades and Labour Council have already given us a really good model about how you mobilise at a local level, where they have had rallies of some thousands of people in Wollongong opposing the prospect of an East Coast base in Port Kembla. But obviously, the community of Newcastle could mobilise and say, well, can we be guaranteed we're not going to be a base? We need to pay attention here in Melbourne. Will there be visits by nuclear-powered and nuclear-capable submarines to Victorian ports? And look at some of the history of the 1980s and the anti-nuclear, mobilisations that happened. And obviously, Perth and Fremantle are a long way from here, but they're faced with this massive development, including a site for storing nuclear waste in Stirling, and all this money being put into developing that as a nuclear submarine base. So I think looking at some of those very concrete, tangible things and making them a campaign focus, I think can help to translate the broader crises into action.
Any other thoughts?
Just to back in Tim and Hamish there, does anyone remember during the federal election campaign when Peter Dutton said something like, oh, well, we'll have to reconsider the NDIS spending because, AUKUS? It was like, seriously? Like, I know Peter Dutton didn't win, thank God, but it sort of feels like a lot of the time really critical programs are being taken away from us by stealth, and we need to acknowledge the fact that things don't work. And so, you know, you ask any HACSU member right now, do they feel like the mental health system is in a better position before the Royal Commission? I guarantee you the vast majority of them will say no. Same in disability, same in drug and alcohol, same in aged care. I could go on and on and on and on. So, you know, last week I was at the Kindy rally for the AEU comrades. You know, first time they've been on strike in, 10 years? Because it's so underfunded. Making these connections across sectors is going to be critically important, whether it's public sector or private sector, to mobilise very quickly to also educate as many working class people as we can. Because the thing that I always think about is, look, I've got people in my family, I'm from North Queensland originally, who maybe don't engage in the news heaps, but they get the snippets, and the snippets tell them that backing in the United States and being the deputy sheriff yet again will keep you safe. And it's bullshit, and we have to speak against it.
Much as we'd love to keep this particular segment going, there have been lots of very patient people with us, so we need to give you your voice, or at least we need to recognise you may want to ask a question of any of our guests, or you may have one short, brief idea you want to share in relation to the issues we discussed, but it has to be very brief. So, who's doing the roving microphones? Oh, right. Okay, so, show of hands, and who would like... Yes, please.
I come from WA. I grew up on Garden Island. Garden Island is not the HMAS Stirling base. We fought against that being made a base, and we lost. It was Killen, was the name. Killen, who put it there. It was never meant to be there. It's a very small sound. It has only one little outlet of water. There are cyclones, it's called Cyclone Alley, which goes down there and knocks the whole area of Rockingham for 6 regularly, which it did not that long ago. And I can tell you now, that's one of the worst possible places to have any kind of facility. They are already building the nuclear waste dump. And I went to a talk the other day, the farm was there, it's already under construction. And I just want to say to you that you've got to really talk to the people, make a localised, so just as you say, what you lose for what you're going to get. The question I have is, and it's never getting raised, in this sign-up, we're saying they're going to take their nuclear waste and bury it somewhere in Australia. That's going to cost another $500 billion for God knows how long. That's not discussed. We keep talking about the AUKUS bill. We're not talking about the long-term bill of burying that filthy waste somewhere.
My name's Angela. I'm an advocate from World Beyond War. I'm a fan of James Cameron's submarines, which were built in Sydney Harbour by privatised companies that work with David Attenborough to promote environmentalism. And I also have been studying as a community worker and someone who feels like a victim of war growing up in Australia in contemporary times with a great-grandfather who served this country and a great-grandfather who spoke a number of Aboriginal dialects, although he was not Aboriginal. That our entire economy and tax system of 1915 was created to fund war, and until that is properly addressed, then our entire economy cannot serve people properly. And I'm a frustrated community service worker who has been low paid for a long amount of time, that has to deal with new grads who don't have any education, that go straight into the army on a graduate wage, well above my salary, and then get paid to train in weapons that are purely to kill people. And meanwhile, we are struggling in the community service sectors. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Microphone, please.
Was that microphone?
don't think it was.
She wasn't using it.
There we go.
Can we get
Yeah, Phil Griffiths is my name. Yes, earlier Tim said that what we need is uproar in the community against this. I just want to say, we have uproar in the community against this. And at the moment it's focused on the war in Gaza. You go onto the campuses and listen to what's being said about the war in Gaza, it's being linked to all Australian militarism. It's being linked to AUKUS. The students protesting about Gaza are also protesting against AUKUS degrees on campus. You go to the schools, the teachers are campaigning not just against AUKUS, but they're linking AUKUS to the crime, the genocide in Gaza. And when they do all this on campus and in the schools, who's the enemy? The enemy isn't Richard Marles, although he is the enemy. The enemy is the school principal. Right? It's not even the Minister for Education, it's the school principal. It's the Dean of the Faculty. It's the University Administration, the University Senate. In other words, it's the entire apparatus of the ruling class. It's not just a few people at the top. And I think the thing about that is that, firstly, I think that the thing that these people are also very focused on is all Australian militarism, which is justified and legitimised by Australian nationalism. Right? So every time people bang on about I'm a patriot, whether they intend to or not, they are legitimising. They're legitimising the rhetoric that promotes and justifies AUKUS, that justifies support for Israel's genocide, and so on. So we've got to stop it. I'll finish now. We've got to stop that and see that this is not a question of Australian independence or any other such stuff. It's a question of there is a ruling class here who want America to dominate the region, who want to act as their deputy sheriff so that they do dominate the region to protect the profits of our bosses.
I'm just going to make a very brief response, which is basically thank you for making that explicit connection. I think that's very important. And it's extraordinary, is it not, the amount of effort that goes into silencing the dissent about Gaza, that goes into silencing any discussion. And when I say that, you can all think of many different examples, but I had a very angry doctor on the phone to me this morning over breakfast, talking about the fallout from the cancellation of the lunchtime meeting at the Children's Hospital to discuss the impact of war on children. And so I'm going to give another plug for the event. This is tomorrow night, isn't it? In the drill hall at 6:30 p.m. That's the old army barracks, actually, very near the Vic Market. Gaza defending health advocacy. So it's about this very question. So thank you for raising it.
Just before I acknowledge the next speaker, just a question. The proceedings are being filmed. Is there anyone in this room who would not wish to be themselves to appear in the film? Is there anyone? No. Okay, very good. Thank you so much.
A bit late.
All right. Now, your hand was up.
Yes. I'm Bill O'Loughlin. There's one area we haven't really talked about today, which is the impact that's possible here with the money for this coming from development assistance or foreign aid. And the reason it's worth paying attention to is we already have the experience of this in the world. We all know about Trump abolishing their aid program globally. But we've already seen in a number of German countries and in Britain, they have cut back on their aid budgets in order to meet their increased spending in military. Particularly in Britain, Gifford, which was their overseas development assistance, was one of the best in the world. They funded it at a much higher rate than the normal percentage and the country was proud of it. The Summit government has gutted it, absolutely gutted it. The net result around the world globally is it's reckoned that about 50% of the global aid that was there last year is no longer coming out now because of all this. So one thing is, no one's talking about it. I suspect it's because there is just so much happening politically at the moment between Gaza and Washington and whatever, that what's happening in the developing world has been just not getting the attention. But I suppose my question for the panel is, we haven't mentioned it here today. It is very likely that money will come from the aid budget because history shows us that it's the one that people will not worry about if it gets gutted. We have a history of making foreign commitments in other areas like peacekeeping or whatever, and we take the money out of the aid budget for that to meet that. So we could possibly see it being directed towards PNG for military purposes, but they're using the aid budget for, God knows what, bureaucratic language. So my point is, we haven't mentioned it, why not? Is that reflective of a general naivety or kind of it's too far off the agenda to get picked up, and is it something we should be considering? Thanks.
Anyone wants to have a go at that?
Foreign aid in Australia has been a disgrace for a long time. It's been falling and falling and falling. It went up a little when the Gillard government was in. I think I agree with you entirely that that is one thing that will go, and in terms of political lobbying, it's a disgrace that it isn't a higher priority in people's minds. But I actually stick with Steph. I think, unfortunately, from a purely political leverage point of view, you're much better off saying we should have better healthcare, we should have better mental health care, we should be... The deficiencies here at home are much more powerful politically, which is tragic. I think the cuts in the aid budgets globally are very, very sad. Just a postscript to that, since October 7, 2023, the US has given about $18 billion in military aid to Israel.
Can I just throw in a very quick point, which is that I'm a big believer in prevention, and I have a fond hope that aid is one part of the prevention of war. And, it's not, again, sufficient, but it can be seen in that light. There are many other more important reasons for foreign aid, human decency just being one of them, but I think we neglect aid in our region in particular at our peril.
Okay.
I just wanted to add to that as well that I think that we've talked about that this is a moment for us to really rethink our security, and I think that Australians are really open to rethinking that. And they are because of Trump. Trump offers this perverse opportunity to do that because the US AID cuts, I think, are a critical part of that. So one study that I've read suggests that as a direct result of those cuts, 14 million people will die. As a direct result, not even an indirect result. And if that's not a threat to global security, and particularly to our regional security, then what is? And I think we can fairly easily make the argument about that kind of aid being an investment in regional security and what actually genuinely makes people safer. And there's a moment to do that we don't usually have, because I think people can see quite clearly that billions of dollars in military aid to Israel, or just handing over $800 million to the Trump administration and saying, here, try and build us some submarines. We don't need a return on our deposit. People can see how ridiculous that is, and I think people can also make the connection. They can see that what Trump is doing domestically is being projected out into the world, and that we want no part of that. So I do think this is a real moment where people are seeing the reality of those consequences in a way that they wouldn't always do.
And I think just quickly, a kid is a kid is a kid. A healthcare worker is a healthcare worker is a healthcare worker, right? And God help Melbourne if someone was dropping bombs on the Alfred and St Vincent's in the Royal Melbourne. We want aid. It's a moral imperative, and it is a preventative war effort. And I think any healthcare worker in the room, community development worker, disability worker, mental health worker would say the same, that we are a global healthcare family and we have a duty of care to our patients, consumers, participants. Simple as that.
Time for one microphone here, please. To the front.
This is a direct question. Some information that I haven't been able to find out about is how much Australia has already paid to the United States? And also about the legality of pulling out, is there contracts and so forth, and where do we stand legally and about all the financial stuff if we decide to pull out?
I don't think we really know very much.
Yeah, we don't know. That's the point. What we do know is that Australia has committed around about $5 billion each to the US submarine, the US shipbuilding industry and the UK shipbuilding industry. That's real money, and I think 2 or 3 billion by the end of next year to the US is what's a billion here or there. In the treaty agreements that we do know of, a party can give a year's notice of withdrawal, but the privilege of that really sits with the US and the UK. So that's what we do know. We also know that whatever the amounts of money, there's no return, so we don't get that $5 billion back when the submarines don't appear. But it also goes further than that. So in the international agreements that, as I said, that we know about, we've also indemnified the US and UK. So if they give us, I don't know, like bits of submarines that don't work or an instruction manual with a mistake, that's on us. It's too bad. Like, that's how bad it is. No guarantee at all.
And that applies specifically to the reactors that are going to be in place. The Americans are indemnified if they leak, if they drop out, whatever. But the other day is Mars announced $12 billion for spending at HMAS Stirling and at what's now called Defence Precinct Henderson, which is basically the BAE marine construction site from Fremantle. $12 billion, and most of that's actually going to move fairly quickly. And it followed very clear hints from so-called Washington insiders, in other words, defence officials from the last administration, sort of hitting the microphone now. Oh, we're a bit worried the Australians are falling behind with their commitments. And so the Trump Hesketh extortion machine worked pretty well for the person who's desperate to have a meeting with Trump. So, sorry, that's part of it.
Can we take the Australian government to court about this?
Any thoughts about withdrawal? Legal implications of withdrawal?
I think you'd all be aware that the President has the discretion to withdraw from the agreement unilaterally if it's going to weaken American undersea capability in any way. The arithmetic around submarine production shows they have to more than double production. They've been trying to do that for years.
By 4.
Sorry?
By 4. They have to increase it by 4.
It's absurd. In addition, I came across a quote recently saying that these submarines, the Virginia-class submarines are problematic in terms of maintenance and in terms of being actually able to go to sea, to be operable. And, seriously, the British have 5 on a very good day 2 in the water, but there's none in the water at the moment. There is no way we are getting these submarines. And if we do get them, we'll probably get the ones that have major maintenance problems.
All right. One last question, absolutely last question.
I don't think the US Congress has ratified that treaty. I haven't heard that the Australian Parliament has ratified the treaty. A hell of a lot of money being passed around without anybody having ratified this thing.
There's no treaty.
Must be my accent.
There's no treaty involved. The UK-US one, that's fine. But the actual provision of the submarines, that's not a treaty. Well, contract. Well, I'm sure there are contracts. You know, the list of contracts we're not told about, I think, is very long. And again, this is part of the, I think, Tim stressed the issue about accountability. That it's really interesting, the person I hear, this is just for information, the person I hear attacking AUKUS decision-making, the internal decision-making, most cogently, week after week, is a defence journalist, the editor of Australian Defence Magazine, Kim Bergman, who we usually say the last person, but he eviscerates them week after week on AUKUS and many other things. And we need to spread that word, that something is dangerously wrong with our defence, defence decision-making capabilities.
Sucking up.
Oh, certainly that, and much more.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all of you for Q&A, for the conversation we had a little while ago, and of course for your contributions to begin with. I'll thank you more formally in a moment. Now we've got a bit of work to do, and I would appreciate if people didn't start leaving in the middle of this 10 minutes or so that we will take to do it. The first thing, those who have the coalition is very keen to put a couple of resolutions, a longer one and a shorter one, before you for your support. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we don't have time to take suggestions, amendments. It's really as it is. Either you like it or you don't. So, if I may, I think the resolution may well go up, I don't know, but in any case I'm going to read it carefully and slowly, and hopefully it will meet with your, it will find favour in the room. Resolution 1 on AUKUS, the second one's on the situation in Gaza. Today is the International Day of Peace. It is therefore appropriate that we, the people of Melbourne, attending this public forum at the Victorian Trades Hall, move the following resolution. We demand that the AUKUS military agreement with the USA and Britain be cancelled. And then it goes on to say, at a cost of over 368 billion or 35 million a day every day for the next 30 years, this aggressive military pact takes public funding away from people's needs and does not serve the best interests of the population of Australia. We demand that the 368 billion of people's taxes is spent on affordable housing for all, schools, hospitals, social and community needs of the people, manufacturing industries, and combating the climate crisis. 2, we oppose Australia being turned into a US military base and launching pad for a US-led war on China, making us a military target. We call for dismantling Pine Gap and all US bases on Australian soil. The AUKUS military pact locks Australia into a warmongering alliance with US imperialists and another US-led devastating war which suits only the interests of the US ruling political classes and the military-industrial complex whom they serve. AUKUS puts us in lockstep with a global aggressive and repressive US. Australian people want peace, justice and independence in our region. From all big powers, we believe Australia would be safer and fairer looking after the needs of all Australians, developing strong and closer trends, security and humanitarian links with our nearest neighbours in the Indo-Pacific region, and adopting a strictly defensive military policy. So there is the resolution. Can I seek your support for it if you're so inclined? How many of us are willing and able to put up our hands and say, we support this resolution? Okay, opposed? Well, I think we can say it is carried unanimously. Thank you. Now for resolution 2, which is much shorter, on Palestine. This meeting strongly condemns US aggressive militarism and the use of Pine Gap for supplying intelligence to Israel for its continuing genocide in Gaza. In the strongest possible terms, we call on the Albanese government to immediately sanction and cut ties with Israel, expel Israel's ambassador, ban the manufacture of weapons parts used by Israel, and cease all military trade with Israel. let's be formal a little bit and put it to a vote. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? I think it is carried by all. Thank you. 49% of the Australian population is now either not born in this country or has one parent not born in this country. And within 15 years, it will be in the 50s. We know, as of now, that in the CBD, and its immediate surrounds, which includes here, the most spoken language at home now is Chinese, by a good margin, and the margin will get bigger. We know that the two largest communities now in Australia, other than those who have English heritage or New Zealand heritage, are the Indian community and the Chinese community. And between them, roughly 2.5 million Australians. They don't have the same visceral addiction to the empire. No. But they have not been adequately integrated into the national conversation. They have not been made welcome in the national conversation. There are many people of Chinese background who feel deeply threatened by the conversation, by political utterances, and by gestures and comments and media stories. So we have potential allies in many parts of Australia, but they have to be cultivated. And the same, of course, is true for our Indigenous communities right across Australia. So there are assets, priceless assets, that we need to cultivate. The movement that's in the making has to be cross-cultural, intercultural, because that's Australia. And it has to be intergenerational. It's not enough for some young people to be doing things and some older people to be doing other things, and the two hardly ever have a proper conversation. So it has to be intergenerational and intercultural, and it has to be outward-looking. And that's the final comment. What's wrong with AUKUS and all the other things of which it is part is not just all the awful things that are happening in this country. It's what we are prevented from doing in our region. It's our inability to think creatively about new ideas, new ways of building peace, new ways of forming relationships, bilateral and multilateral, and importantly, people-to-people relationships. Prime ministers visit countries and they will talk about trade endlessly. They may even talk about security partnerships, but they will pay very little attention to people-to-people connections, to understanding the cultures, the languages, the histories, the politics of the countries in our region, in our geography. And that is one of the most crucial things. The Prime Minister went to China, but he did not meet with too many people from the 40 Australian Studies Centres in China. More Australian Studies Centres in China than in any other country, including the United States. And they get a pittance from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. A pittance. It's a joke. So there is much to do for the positive things that we should be doing, and not least in relation to the United Nations, at a time when senior allies are doing their best to shatter any prospects of effective action. So we should emphasize the positive things that we're missing out on and that we could be doing as a serious middle power committed to the notion of global citizenship. This is the moment, this is the hour, and we dare not ignore it or let it go. I hope all of us can make at least a small contribution in that direction in the months, weeks, and years ahead. Thank you.
Before you head off, today is not only the International Day of Peace, but we also call it as a National Day for Action Against Militarization and AUKUS, and we hope this is the first one of many national days of action against this. And we were going to take a photo outside because also just a month ago was the 80th anniversary of the most horrible nuclear accident that we have had so far. We were going to take it in front of the banner downstairs, but it's raining a lot. So if people on the way out want to come here, we'll take a photo.
Free Palestine! Free In the colony! Happy International Peace Day!
Stop the war games!
Cancel AUKUS!
No war with China.
Yeah, no war with China.
Hang on.
Imperialism.
More schools, less subs.
Thank you.